Short is the story, long is the life.
Wukong's Archive presents China Urban Legends EP11 Tianjin Xikai Cathedral. Lao Yang explains ghost stories. Hello everyone. Today let's talk about one place, the Xikai Cathedral of Tianjin. This story comes from a college roommate of mine. His name is Zhao Lei. He's from Tianjin. In 2008 he came to Beijing for graduate school. Zhao Lei and I shared a dorm room. One sleepless winter night, sitting on his bunk wrapped in a quilt, with only a desk lamp on between us, he told me this story. He talked all night. I've remembered it ever since. Zhao Lei said that most people from Tianjin don't really think much about Xikai Cathedral. To locals, it's just a landmark on Binjiang Road. Tourists take photos, couples go on dates, believers attend mass. It sits right on the busiest commercial street in the city, next to Quanichang and Liaoning Road Snack Street, just a few minutes walk from the porcelain house. During the day it's packed with people. No one would ever connect it with supernatural events. But Zhao Lei said he'd lived in Tianjin for 22 years and heard too many stories about Xikai Cathedral. Some he heard from old folks, some he saw with his own eyes. He said, there's something wrong with Xikai Cathedral. Something dark. The full name of the church is the Xikai Catholic Cathedral, also known as St. Joseph's Cathedral. It sits at number 11, Xining Road, Heping District, Tianjin. Built in 1916, it's the largest Catholic church in Tianjin and one of the most important Catholic buildings in all of North China. The architectural style is French Romanesque. The three front arches are tall and wide, with biblical scenes carved into the lintels above. The main body of the church features three semicircular domes. From the outside, the domes are covered in verdigris copper tiles that gleam with an eerie green light in the sun. The outer walls are built of red and yellow brick, and from a distance the church looks like an ancient castle. At the top stands the cross, which has marked the Tianjin skyline for over 100 years. About this church, Zhao Lei said, there's a saying among Tianjin's elderly, Xikai Cathedral was built right on top of a mass grave. Not an ordinary graveyard. This was the mass burial pit from the Boxer Rebellion outside the Tianjin city walls. In 1900, the Boxer Rebellion swept across North China. Tianjin was one of the most violent battlegrounds. In May of that year, the Boxers burned down more than a dozen foreign churches outside Tianjin and killed over 200 converts. The Qing army and the Boxers together laid siege to the Zhujialan concession outside the city walls. The fighting went on for nearly a month. During that month, hundreds upon hundreds of people died every day on the battlefields outside Tianjin. When the Eight-Nation Alliance broke through and captured the city, they burned, killed, and looted for 3 straight days. The old city was lit up by flames, bodies everywhere. Zhao Lei said his grandfather once told him a detail. After the fighting was over, the moat outside Tianjin's city wall had turned red. No one dared drink from the wells outside the city because the well water was full of blood. The area around Xikai was right where the heaviest fighting had taken place, the place with the most deaths. After the battle ended, the local charity organizations tried to collect and bury the bodies, but there were simply too many. In the end, they dug a huge pit, pushed all the bodies inside, covered them with a layer of lime, then a layer of earth. But because the burial was so hasty, when the ground thawed the following spring, the dirt collapsed and exposed the bones again. The locals had to pile more earth on top, back and forth several times. By the 3rd year, the ground finally stopped pushing up bones. But the weeds grew incredibly tall there, much higher than the surrounding wasteland. On spring nights, swarms of fireflies drifted above it, looking like green sparks floating in the air. The old people of Tianjin said those weren't fireflies, they were phosphorus seeping up from the bones. They called that place the mass grave mound. In 1913, the French Catholic Church decided to build a grand cathedral in Tianjin. When scouting locations, they chose this plot in Xikai. Back then Xikai was still wasteland outside the city, overgrown with weeds, barely touched by human feet. The church authorities may not have known what lay beneath the ground. Or maybe they did, and simply didn't care. Construction began in 1913 and was completed in 1916. The church's cornerstone was laid right on top of the mass grave. When digging the foundation, the workers unearthed quite a few things. Zhao Lei said his grandfather's father, Zhao Lei's great-grandfather, had worked as a laborer on the Xikai Cathedral construction site. The old man said that when they dug down about 2 meters, the shovel hit something hard. They dug it up, it was a thigh bone. Then 7 or 8 more came up, short ones and long ones, piled together as if they'd just been tossed in. The foreman was French. He looked at the bones and said something in Shanghainese, because back then many foremen in the Tianjin French concession had been transferred up from Shanghai. Zhao Lei's great-grandfather couldn't understand what he said, but he saw the foreman wave his hand, telling the workers to throw the bones onto the construction waste pile and keep working. Zhao Lei's great-grandfather said he couldn't sleep that night. Not because he was scared, he was from Tianjin, he'd grown up hearing stories about the mass grave mound. But something didn't sit right in his heart. Those bones had been buried underground for decades, then suddenly dug up and thrown away like trash. He said, Chinese people believe the dead should rest in peace. If you dig people up and don't give them a proper burial, how can they ever rest? Zhao Lei said that his grandfather had lived near Xikai as a child. He said that in the first few years after the church was built, strange sounds could often be heard coming from underground at night. Not wind. Not rats. It was a low, muffled sound, as if many people were crying together. The residents were frightened and went to the priest. The priest said it was the wind passing through the basement. But his grandfather didn't believe it, because the sound only came at night and disappeared during the day. And it was especially clear on overcast and rainy days. Zhao Lei's grandfather also told him something else. In 1939, a massive flood hit Tianjin. The entire Heping district was underwater, in some places deep enough to reach an adult man's chest. All the houses around Xikai Cathedral were flooded, and some old buildings collapsed from the water damage. But the ground floor of Xikai Cathedral stayed dry. Some people said it was because the foundation was higher than the surrounding area. But his grandfather said the church wasn't built on ground much higher than anything else. The strange thing was that the water simply stopped at the church's front entrance, as if something was blocking it from coming in. The priest said it was the protection of the Virgin Mary. But an old woman who lived next door to his grandfather had a different take. She said it wasn't the Virgin Mary protecting the church. It was that whatever was underneath had blocked the water. Nobody paid her any attention. But after the flood waters receded, the ground around the church had sunk by nearly half a meter. The entire church looked like it had been lifted up above the horizon. The front door, which had been at street level, now required 3 steps to get up to. In all of Heping district, only Xikai Cathedral had this kind of ground subsidence. How much empty space was under there, nobody knew. The first time Zhao Lei personally experienced something wrong about Xikai Cathedral was the winter of 2005. He was a sophomore in college that year, home in Tianjin for winter break. December 24th was Christmas Eve. He made plans with some high school friends to go shopping on Binjiang Road. The street was lively that night, full of young people. Shops played Christmas carols, lights were bright everywhere. A long line stretched from the doors of Xikai Cathedral, people waiting to attend the Christmas Eve Mass. Zhao Lei wasn't religious, but he'd always been interested in church architecture. He split off from his friends and stood alone outside the church, wanting to take a good look at the night view of this century-old building. He stood across the street from the main entrance, looking up at the three giant domes. Colored light filtered through the stained glass windows, making the whole church look like a fairy tale castle. He stared for a long time, until his neck got sore. He lowered his head to rub his eyes. And in that instant, as his eyes moved downward, something in his peripheral vision caught his attention. He said he saw it clearly. On the wall beside the rose window above the main entrance, there was something dark red. Moving. He looked up again. The thing had stopped moving. The wall was just a wall. The window was just a window. Nothing unusual. But his skin crawled, because what he'd seen wasn't a trick of light. It was a shape. The shape of a human hand, fingers spread, pressed against the wall, slowly sliding downwards. And the key point, that spot on the wall, was at least 15 meters above the ground. No human could possibly be up there. Zhao Lei said his first thought was that his eyes were playing tricks on him, that it was just fatigue-induced hallucination. But the more he tried not to think about it, the clearer the image became: 5 spread fingers, distinct knuckles, slowly sliding down the wall. He couldn't stay in front of the church anymore. He turned and went to find his friends. When he found them, he realized his back was drenched in cold sweat. Zhao Lei didn't tell anyone about what happened that night. He figured no one would believe him anyway, and he wasn't even sure himself about what he'd seen. But over the next few years, he heard similar experiences from several different people. The first person to tell him was his mother. She was a native of Tianjin, born and raised in Heping district for over 50 years. One time Zhao Lei casually mentioned Xikai Cathedral and asked his mother if she knew anything about it. Her expression changed immediately. His mother said that place was seriously haunted. But she couldn't say exactly what was wrong with it. She just repeated that you shouldn't spend too much time there. Zhao Lei thought this was strange because his mother was a very rational person. She'd worked at a bank for 30 years and never believed in any of that superstitious stuff. The way she reacted that night made his heart sink. If even an accountant who'd worked at a bank for 30 years thought something was wrong with that place, then maybe this wasn't just baseless rumor. The second person to tell him was an elderly neighbor who also lived in Heping district. His surname was Liu. He was 73, a longtime Tianjin local. One day, Zhao Lei was playing chess with him at the mouth of an alley and brought up Xikai Cathedral. Old Liu put down his chess piece, lit a cigarette, and said something that sent chills down Zhao Lei's spine. Old Liu said, "You're not the first person to ask me about Xikai Cathedral. Over the years, quite a few things have happened. That basement under the church, I went in there as a kid. There's something unclean down there." Zhao Lei pressed him for details. Old Liu said that as a child, he lived in an alley behind Xikai Cathedral. In 1958, when he was about 10 years old, he and some friends climbed over the wall into the church's back courtyard. There was an iron door in the back, secured with a big padlock. But someone had broken the lock. The iron door was slightly ajar. The kids were bold, so they pulled it open and went in. Behind the iron door was a very narrow staircase, spiraling downward. There were no lights. The walls were wet, covered in moisture. They went down about 2 or 3 stories deep. The space at the bottom was surprisingly large, about half the size of a basketball court. But it was flooded everywhere. Pieces of wood and scraps of fabric floated on the water. The air had a very strange smell. Not dampness. Not mildew. It was a sweet, cloying stench that made you want to vomit. Old Liu said they shone their flashlight inside. As the beam swept across the walls, they saw things. To this day he's not sure what he saw. He said there were patterns painted on the walls. Not crosses. Not Jesus. Not any symbols he could recognize. Those patterns were twisted, curving, like some ancient script, or like contorted human figures. When the flashlight hit them, they seemed wet, reflecting the light. Old Lou said he was 10 years old and fearless about most things. But when he saw those patterns, he felt fear for the first time in his life. Not the racing heart kind of being startled. It was a cold that seeped from deep inside his bones. He said he wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. It was only after one of his friends took off running that he managed to follow. After that day, he never went into Xikai Cathedral again. Zhao Lei paused here. He looked out the window. It was a deep winter night in Beijing. Nothing visible outside. He asked me, "Did you know that each of those 3 domes originally had a cross on top?" I said I didn't. He said, all 3 crosses were taken down in 1966. When the Cultural Revolution began, Red Guards in Tianjin stormed Xikai Cathedral. They smashed the stained glass windows, overturned the altar, and burned the scriptures and icons. The golden statue of Jesus above the main entrance was pulled down, dragged through the streets for public humiliation, and finally thrown into a bonfire. The 3 crosses on the domes were yanked down with thick ropes and thrown to the ground. When one of the crosses fell from the dome, it broke several ribs, not because it fell on someone, but because the rope snapped and the cross came straight down on a Red Guard's chest. That Red Guard was taken to the hospital. He died shortly after arriving. This story spread throughout Tianjin. Some people called it retribution. Others said it was just an accident. But regardless, the crosses were gone. Zhao Lei said that after the church was destroyed, no one went near it for a while. The church doors were locked. The courtyard grew over with weeds. But the neighbors said that during that period, strange noises often came from inside the church. Not hammering. Not voices. It was a hollow, distant sound, like someone crying. In 1979, the church authorities finally regained control of Xikai Cathedral and began restoration work. While repairing it, the workers found something in the basement. The official account says there were some old furniture, broken boards, and animal bones in the basement. But Zhao Lei heard a different version from an old worker who had participated in the restoration. The old worker's surname was Sunday. He was from Tianjin, in his 40s at the time. He was a plasterer responsible for restoring the interior walls. Master Sun said he saw something in that basement that he'd never forget for the rest of his life. He said it was in the northeast corner of the basement. A large section of plaster had fallen off the wall, exposing the wall structure underneath. But it wasn't brick or cement underneath. It was a layer of dark brown, hardened crust, like something had dried and formed a shell. He struck it with his trowel. The crust broke open, and some fragments of bone fell out from inside. Master Sun said the bones were very small, badly fragmented, impossible to tell what animal they'd come from. But then he thought about it, if they were animal bones, why would they be embedded inside a wall? He went to the supervisor. The supervisor took a look and said it was just old construction debris mixed into the building material, and told him to clean it up. Master Sun thought something wasn't right, but as a low-level worker he couldn't really argue. He shoveled the bones away. Zhao Lei said he later looked up a lot of information. The basement of Xikai Cathedral is actually a very large space. In the original architectural design, the basement was intended to be used as a crypt. European Catholic cathedrals traditionally used their basements as burial crypts for bishops and prominent church members. Xikai Cathedral followed this design. But after the church was completed, Whether the basement was ever actually used to bury anyone, nobody knows. Zhao Lei said the thing that truly scared him happened in the summer of 2007. That summer he hadn't gone home, he was interning in Beijing. One weekend in mid-July, he went back to Tianjin for a couple of days. On the second day, he was wandering around Binjiang Road by himself, and somehow ended up in front of Xikai Cathedral again. The church doors were open. Out of curiosity, he went inside. The interior was much more spacious than he'd imagined. High vaulted ceilings, row after row of dark wooden pews, stained glass windows depicting biblical stories. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the western windows, casting a multicolored glow on the floor. The atmosphere was quiet and solemn, a completely different world from the bustling commercial street outside. Zhao Lei sat down on one of the pews for a while. He wasn't a believer, but the environment made him feel at peace. A few other people sat scattered around the church, heads bowed in prayer. After about 10 minutes, he was about to leave. As he stood up, he casually glanced toward the altar. Behind the altar was a huge mural depicting the crucifixion. He'd seen pictures of it before, but seeing it in person was still breathtaking. The mural was enormous, it nearly covered the entire wall. But one detail caught his eye. In the lower right corner of the mural, near the floor, there was a small black hole. At first he thought it was damage, paint flaking off the mural, leaving a blank spot. But looking more closely, he realized it wasn't a hole. It was a door. He walked along the side aisle toward it. Getting closer, he could see that it was indeed a small door, about half a person's height, painted the same color as the mural. If you weren't looking carefully, you'd never notice it. There was no handle, just a small latch. Where did that door lead? Zhao Lei said he did something that even now he feels was reckless. He pulled the latch open. The door wasn't locked. A light pull and it swung open. Behind the door was a very narrow staircase leading downward. The steps were steep, completely dark, nothing visible at all. A wave of that sweet, cloying stench rushed up and hit him in the face. Zhao Lei said he couldn't describe the smell. It wasn't rot. It wasn't dampness. It was a very old, very heavy smell, like something that had been sealed away for countless years and was suddenly opened. He stood at the threshold for maybe 10 seconds. A voice inside him said, "Don't go down." But he couldn't help wondering what was down there. In the end, he didn't go down. Not because he didn't want to, but because a church worker noticed him. A middle-aged man in black clothes walked over quickly and said one sentence in a very heavy tone. "You can't go in there." Zhao Lei said the man's voice wasn't loud, but the tone was extremely stern, carrying an undeniable tension. He didn't even ask who Zhao Lei was or why he was there. He just reached out, closed the door, and slid the latch back into place. Zhao Lei asked him what was down there. The man didn't answer. He turned and walked away. After leaving the church, Zhao Lei couldn't calm down for a long time. He wasn't the type to be easily frightened. But what happened that day made him deeply uneasy. Not fear of the unknown, it was something more primal, an unease he couldn't put into words. After returning to Beijing, he started searching online for information about the Xikai Cathedral basement. He searched for a long time and found scattered posts on various forums. Most were just rumors, not especially reliable, but he wrote them down anyway. One post stood out more than the others. The poster said they were from Tianjin. An older relative had once worked as a caretaker at Xikai Cathedral. According to the relative, the church's basement did connect to some tunnels, but those tunnels weren't dug when the church was built. They were already there, much older. The church had been built on top of them. Where those tunnels led, nobody knew. Some people who went deep inside reached a dead end they couldn't pass. Others said the tunnels eventually led to the high river. Zhao Lei said that in the comments under that post, someone claiming to be a geological survey worker replied. That person said they had once done geological surveys around Binjiang Road and found the underground geological structure beneath Xikai Cathedral to be very unusual. There was a large hollow area underground, not a natural cavern, but man-made. The shape was very irregular, and the area was large. But what exactly it was, the survey report didn't say. Zhao Lei later went to the Tianjin library to look up local historical records. He spent 2 afternoons in the local documents reading room of the Heping District Library, flipping through dozens of books on Tianjin's old city history. Some of the information he found corroborated what he'd heard. Historical records show that the Xikai area was indeed one of Tianjin's execution grounds in the late Qing dynasty. Kaishiku was in Beijing, but Tianjin had similar execution grounds, just not as well known. The people executed were mostly bandits, rebels, and boxers who had resisted the foreigners. After execution, the bodies were buried on the spot, very shallowly. Sometimes wild dogs would dig the bodies up. Local residents were used to it, because in those days, people dying wasn't anything unusual. But one detail made Zhao Lei deeply uncomfortable. The historical records said that some of the prisoners executed in this area had been held in a temporary prison near the church's original site before their execution. In other words, before they were beheaded, they were already on this patch of ground. When the French later built the church, part of it was probably constructed on the site of that temporary prison. Some also said that the location of Xikai Cathedral, in an even earlier period, the Ming dynasty, had been a temple. But the temple didn't enshrine proper gods. It was dedicated to miscellaneous folk deities. The temple wasn't large, but its incense was very strong because the locals said the spirits there were very responsive. After the Ming dynasty fell, the temple went into decline and eventually collapsed into ruins. The land lay fallow for over 200 years, until the French came and built the church on top of it. Zhao Lei specifically asked his grandfather about that temple. His grandfather said he had indeed heard old folks talk about it. Nobody remembered the temple's name anymore, but the older generation called the place Yanwang Temple, King Yama's temple. Not because the temple actually enshrined Yama, the king of hell, but because the place was so heavy with yin energy that the living couldn't stay there long without discomfort. Only the dead belonged there. As a child, his grandfather had gone to the temple's ruins with some friends and picked up a few copper coins and porcelain shards. But he never stayed long, because there was always an indescribable oppressive feeling there, a tightness in the chest that came on after just a few minutes. Zhao Lei later met an antique collector on a collecting forum. His surname was He. He was in his 50s and ran a small antique shop on Shenyang Road. Zhao Lei went to see him once and brought up Xikai Cathedral. After listening, He pulled out an old photograph from a dusty cardboard box. The photo was black and white, the edges yellowed and curled. The image showed a group of men in long gowns and Mandarin jackets standing on an empty plot of land, behind them a building under construction. On the back of the photo, written in pencil, "Breaking ground at Xikai Cathedral, April of the second year of the Republic." He said he'd bought the photo from a scrap collector 10 years ago for 2 yuan. The people in it were probably involved in the church's construction, possibly Chinese employees of the French church. He said he'd had it appraised. The photo was genuine, definitely taken in 1913. But there was one thing in the photo that had bothered him. Zhao Lei took the photo and looked at it himself. The picture showed the foundation construction site. Stones and timber were laid out on the ground. A few workers stood nearby. The partially built church was in the background. Everything looked normal. Old He pointed to the lower left corner and told Zhao Lei to look carefully. Zhao Lei brought the photo closer. In the lower left corner, at the edge of the foundation pit, there was a blurry shape. The shape was large, too large to be a person, and it didn't look like construction material either. It was half buried in the dirt, only partially exposed. Zhao Lei squinted at it for a long time, and then suddenly recognized it. It was a human skull. Large, intact, staring straight into the camera. Old He said he'd shown the photo to people who dealt in old antiques. Some said it was a skeleton that the workers had dug up during construction, accidentally captured in the frame. Others said the position of the skull was wrong, it wasn't inside the pit, but at the edge of it, as if someone had deliberately placed it there. As to why it was placed there, nobody could say. Zhao Lei said the strangest thing of all was the bell of Xikai Cathedral. The bell tower housed a bronze bell brought from France when the church was built. The sound was deep and rich. On clear days, it could be heard across half of Heping district. When Zhao Lei was a child, he lived in an old building 2 blocks from the church and could hear the bell every evening. In summer, the bell would travel through the leaves of the plane trees, enter through the window, deep, drawn-out, melancholy. He had grown up with that sound. He had never thought there was anything strange about it. Until 2008. He was back in Tianjin for Chinese New Year. On the evening of New Year's Day, he was out walking alone. When he reached Binjiang Road, the church bell suddenly rang. He instinctively checked his phone. 11 p.m. exactly. But the problem was, the bell at Xikai Cathedral had been silent since the 1970s restoration. The bell's striker had been broken by Red Guards during the Cultural Revolution. Since then, it was just decoration. Zhao Lei was certain about this fact, because in the 22 years he'd lived in Tianjin, he had never once heard the church bell at night. But that night, he definitely heard it. The bell rang 11 times. Each ring was about 3 or 4 seconds apart, very regular, very deep, like a drum beating against his chest. He stood rooted to the spot, listening to all 11 rings. Then the bell stopped. The silence returned. An occasional taxi drove past. The dim yellow streetlights shone on the snow-covered ground. He stood there for a long time, so long that his feet went numb from the cold. Later he asked a small convenience store owner nearby if he'd heard the bell. The owner gave him a strange look and said, "What bell? You must have misheard." Zhao Lei said, "I didn't mishear. I'm absolutely certain. Those bells didn't come in through my ears. They came through my bones." In the summer of 2008, Zhao Lei came back to Tianjin from Beijing for summer break and heard about something. That June, Xikai Cathedral underwent minor interior renovations. While digging foundations in the back courtyard, the construction crew uncovered something. A tombstone. It wasn't large, about 40 centimeters wide and 60 centimeters high. It was made of blue stone. The surface was heavily weathered, most of the writing illegible. But the crew managed to make out a few characters, a person's name, and a date, the 26th year of Guangxu. The 26th year of Guangxu was 1900, the year of Gengzi. A line of smaller characters was carved on the stone, barely decipherable. It read, "Beneath this stone lie 3,000 buried bones. May the Lord have mercy. May heaven watch over them." The construction crew stopped work immediately. The foreman called the church authorities. Someone from the church came, looked at the tombstone, said continue construction, and had the stone moved to a temporary shelter. What happened to that tombstone afterward, nobody knows. After Zhao Lei heard this story, he went specifically to find someone from the construction crew. The man's surname was Meng. He was from Jiangsu and had been doing construction in Tianjin for 15 years. Master Meng said that when they dug up the tombstone, there was an older, experienced worker standing nearby watching. That man was from Tianjin. When he saw the inscription, his face changed color. He said, "There's something down there." Master Meng asked what he meant. The older worker pointed at the ground beneath their feet and said, "This place, during the Eight-Nation Alliance War, too many people died here. Back then they buried them layer by layer. One layer of soil packed down, the dead underneath without even a coffin. Then the French came and built the church. When they drove the foundation piles, they must have churned up a lot of things. But we Chinese have a saying, the dead should rest in peace. Those buried down there, over 100 years, have never received a single stick of incense. They are not at peace." Master Meng said his back went cold after hearing that. After Zhao Lei finished the story, I asked him, "So what's the truth about Xikai Cathedral? Is there really something unclean down there, or is it all just coincidence and legend?" Zhao Lei was silent for a moment. Then he said, "I don't know either. But from that day on, I've never set foot in Xikai Cathedral again." I asked him again, "Then why do you think the bell rang?" Zhao Lei looked at me and said, "Have you ever considered, maybe the bell was never actually broken? Maybe the church management decided not to let it ring anymore. Because they found that every time after it rang, things happened in the church that couldn't be explained." "Like what?" He said, "Like one time, after the bell was temporarily repaired and rang once. That night, all the pews in the church started shaking by themselves. The caretaker thought it was an earthquake. He ran outside, nothing on the street, everything normal. He went back inside the church. The pews were still shaking. Another time, after the bell stopped ringing, water started bubbling up in a sump pit in the basement. Not fermentation bubbles. It was like something breathing underwater, gurgling, churning upward." Zhao Lei said he heard all these things from old residents who lived near the church. Not all of it might be true. But the people telling these stories weren't just one or two, they were multiple unrelated people who described different incidents, all happening around the same few days after the bell was repaired. So after that, the church simply never fixed the bell again. They left it broken. Zhao Lei said, "Some things, once they're broken, you just don't fix them." But there was one more detail about the bell. Zhao Lei later mentioned it to his grandfather. His grandfather was silent for a long time, then said something significant. His grandfather said, when the church was restored after the Cultural Revolution, the workers did fix the bell. They rang it 3 times, always late at night. The first time, a dog from a house in the alley behind the church barked all night. The second time, an old locust tree in the church's back courtyard fell over for no reason. The trunk was riddled with tiny holes, as if something had eaten it hollow from the inside. The third time, words appeared on the wall of a house next to the church. Not written on, carved in. Very deep, as if dug out with fingernails. The writing was unintelligible, not Chinese, not English, not any known script. That family was so terrified they moved away. After that, the church never fixed the bell again. After telling this, the grandfather said something to Zhao Lei that he said he would remember for the rest of his life. His grandfather said, "Lei, some things don't speak not because they're dead. It's because when they do speak, you can't hear them." After graduation, Zhao Lei and I gradually lost touch. But I've never forgotten this story. Every time I travel to Tianjin for work, pass through Binjiang Road, and look up at those 3 green copper domes of Xikai Cathedral, I think back to that winter night, Zhao Lei, wrapped in a quilt, sitting on the top bunk, telling me this story. The church still stands as it always has, unchanged after over 100 years. Binjiang Road is bustling as ever. Young people take photos in front of the church. Couples sit on the steps taking selfies. Tourists queue up for visits. In the daytime, it looks like nothing more than an ordinary church, a tourist attraction, a Tianjin landmark. But at night, especially late at night, when the last wave of tourists has dispersed and the neon lights of the commercial street gradually go dark, when the whole church sinks into blackness, if you stand at a distance and look at its silhouette, you'll see those three domes like three giant burial mounds, standing beneath the night sky of Tianjin. The light filtering through the stained glass windows isn't warm. It's a deep, unnameable glow of some indeterminate color. Zhao Lei said that people in Tianjin have a saying, "The cross at Xikai Cathedral, there's only one direction from which you can see its front. That direction is north, looking from the high river. From any other direction, the cross is sideways. Standing in front of the church, you only see the edge of the cross, a thin line, like a blade standing upright." He said he didn't know why it was designed that way. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe not. Zhao Lei also told me one more thing, from a colleague of his mother's. The colleague's surname was Wang. She'd been head nurse at a hospital in Heping district for over 20 years. Head nurse Wang said that during the 1976 Tangshan earthquake, the tremors were very strong in Tianjin too. That night, she was urgently called back to the hospital. As she passed by Binjiang Road, she saw the three domes of Xikai Cathedral shaking violently in the distance. She thought the church was going to collapse, so she stopped to watch. But the church didn't collapse. The three domes swayed for a long time, like three giant pendulums swinging in the night sky of Tianjin, but they never fell. The ground around it cracked. Boundary walls collapsed. Several old buildings on Binjiang Road came down. But Xikai Cathedral remained completely intact. After the earthquake, church clergy went to inspect the building's structure. They found cracks in the brickwork inside the domes. When they climbed up to repair them, they found something inside. Head nurse Wang had heard this secondhand, but her account was very detailed. In the wall cavity of the western dome, they found a note. The note was stuffed into a glass bottle, which was sealed into the brickwork. The note, written in brush, read in Chinese, "Bones are deposited here. In the Lord's name, may souls rest for 1,000 years." There was no signature, no date. No one knows who placed that note, or how many years it had been inside that wall. It could have been placed by French clergy when the church was built. Or it could have been placed by Chinese people from an even earlier time. The two characters, Ji Gui, deposit bones, meant that someone had temporarily stored bones there. This suggests that at least one person knew who was buried beneath the church's foundation. They had placed the remains of the dead inside this church, hoping that through the church's power, the souls might find peace. But the phrase, "Jiazhu Ji Ming," in the Lord's name, was somewhat ambiguous. Did Lord refer to the God of Catholicism, or to something else? Head nurse Wang said they later found the same glass bottles and notes in the other two domes as well. 3 domes, 3 bottles, 3 notes. The notes were handed over to the church's higher authorities. After that, the church never conducted any formal investigation of the Xikai Cathedral basement again. Zhao Lei said, maybe not reaching into what's down there, that in itself is a form of respect. But there was one thing Zhao Lei never figured out. That hand he saw on the church wall on Christmas Eve 2005. Was it pushing out from inside the wall, or pressing in from the outside? If it came from inside, what's inside that wall? If it came from outside, where did it come from? Zhao Lei said he replayed it many times afterward. The image was too clear to be a hallucination. That night the temperature was below freezing. A thin layer of frost had formed on the wall. When that hand pressed against it, the frost melted, leaving a clear palm print. The print stayed on the wall for at least 2 or 3 seconds, then slowly faded and disappeared. He's asked himself many times. He never found an answer. Zhao Lei said he later met a taxi driver from Tianjin online. The driver had worked the night shift on Binjiang Road for over a decade and knew the Xikai Cathedral area well. Zhao Lei got to talking with him, and the driver told him something. The driver said that when he drove late shifts, he often passed by Xikai Cathedral at 2 or 3 in the morning. Several times, when he drove past the church, he saw the main door open a crack. Not wide open like during the day, just a gap of about 30 or 40 centimeters. Looking through the gap, it was pitch black inside, nothing visible. At first he thought it might be thieves, but then figured there wasn't much to steal in a church. He tried pulling on the door once, but couldn't. It felt like something was holding it from inside. When he looked back a few minutes later, the door was closed again. The driver said this happened 5 or 6 times. Eventually he got used to it, and when driving late at night, he just tried not to look at the church. Another old-timer taxi driver told him that water stains sometimes appeared on the steps of Xikai Cathedral. Not rainwater. Not water splashed by a sprinkler truck. It was patches of dark brown liquid. If you touched it, it wasn't sticky, but the color was deep, like diluted blood. As soon as the sun came out, it dried up and nothing could be seen. But in the early morning hours, it was frequently visible. Zhao Lei asked the old driver, "Don't you locals all know about these things?" The old driver laughed and said, "Knowing and talking are 2 different things. It's not like it's anything to be proud of. Keep it to yourself, and that's the way it is. Some things perhaps will never have answers." That's the whole story. After that night, I never talked about Xikai Cathedral with Zhao Lei again, and he never brought it up. Some things only need to be said once. Now, every time I travel to Tianjin for work, I go around Binjiang Road and take Inko Road instead. Not because I'm scared. I just don't want to see those 3 green domes anymore. Some things are better seen from a distance. Some secrets are better left uncovered. The story ends here. What do you think? If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe. New urban legend every day.